and gentlemen, to our brand new DVD called The Illuminati Gods at the Olympic Games. My name is Dr. Marquis, and you are at DVD 14, Volume 1 in this series called Secrets of the Illuminati. When we think of the ancient Olympic Games, we have to think that this is a very old event. If we go by the historical accounts, the first original ancient Olympic Games would have begun back in 776 BC. Now, to the Greeks, this is very, very important that they associate themselves with the ancient Greek games, because according to Greek legend now, Hercules, the son of Zeus, the mythological strongman, after he had finished, I should say, his 12 labors, in order to honor his father, Zeus, he created an athletic event which nowadays we call the Olympic Games. Now, originally, the very first Olympic Games was actually held in Olympia, Greece. Now, we didn't have all the fancy games or the big parades or anything like that that they have nowadays, no. You see, the first games would have included like foot races, javelin tosses, maybe the discus, and contests of strength. But that would have been basically it in the first original games. When we consider the historic records of the ancient Olympic Games, the Olympic Games were actually one of the two main rituals in ancient Greece. The second, and older religious festival, was that of the Eleusinian Mysteries. These are, of course, many different versions and arguments of the details pertaining to the ancient Olympic Games. Suffice it to say, the ancient Olympic Games lasted from 776 BC to 394 AD, when Theodosius I suppressed the games as part of his campaign to impose Christianity as the state religion. Now, the culture of the ancient Olympic Games, it really must be understood that these games were as much of a religious festival as they were an athletic event. You have to remember, the games themselves were held in order to honor Zeus, and of course the rest of the Greek pantheon, but there was also that religious element, as I said, to the games. During the middle day of the Olympic Games, and I mean right in the middle, when the first day began and all this other stuff, and they were having all these races and such, they would actually stop in the middle of the day so that 100 oxen could be sacrificed to honor the head of the pantheon, Zeus. They would just stop everything, bring out all the oxen, and this really was. It was a horrific event according to our perspective. But for them, this was normal. You take all these animals, you slay them, and you honor the ancient gods. In this case, it would have been the head of the pantheon, Zeus. Now, eventually, around 445 BC, because the religious aspects of the Olympic Games had grown to such a high proportion, they had built a temple that became known as the Sanctuary of Zeus. A famous sculptor known as Phidias had made a 43-foot tall statue of Zeus out of ivory and gold and placed it on the throne. To this very day, that statue of Zeus is considered to be one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. The Greek historian Strabo had this to say: "The glory of the temple persisted on account of the festal assembly and of the Olympic Games, in which the prize was a crown, in which were regarded as a sacred, the greatest games in the world. The temple was adorned by its numerous offerings, which were dedicated there from all parts of Greece. This statue of Zeus would now preside over the games, and it would be at this temple that the sacrificing of the oxen would be made and where offerings would be left." In the past, there had been numerous attempts to revitalize the ancient Olympic Games, and some of them really came close to reflecting what we would call the modern day Olympic Games, if you would. A couple examples would be like oh, here we go. Between 1612 and 1642, there was the Cotswold Olympic Games, which were annually held. That would have been in Chipping Campden in England. These Olympic Games consisted of various country sports, not the fancy sports you would expect nowadays, but we're talking country sports that would evolve, you know, maybe some type of equine sporting events, things along that nature. And these games were first organized by Robert Dover, who was a lawyer. These events, as a matter of fact, interesting enough, when the Olympic Games were being bid on by England for the 2012 Games, these old 17th century Olympic Games events became part of their actual bidding and part of the opening of the ancient British Games. Then, of course, there was the French Olympic Games. This was a national Olympic event that was also held annually in France. From 1796 through 1798, these games were held, but this was shortly before the French Revolution, if you remember, in 1798, so they really didn't last long, unfortunately. Now let's get into the Wenlock Olympian Games. In 1850, an Olympian class was set up by Dr. William Penny Brooks at Much Wenlock in Shropshire, England. In 1959, Dr. Brooks had changed the name to the Wenlock Olympian Games, and the Wenlock Olympian Society was founded on November 15, 1860 by Dr. Brooks. This was another, annual sporting festival, and interesting enough, it continues to this very day. Their Olympic medal had the Greek god of victory, Nike, engraved on it, plus one of the two mascots of the 2012 Summer Olympic Games had been named Wenlock in honor of the original Wenlock Olympian Games. Next would be the Liverpool Games. Between 1862 and 1867, Liverpool, England held an annual Grand Olympic. Created by John Hulley and Charles Melly, the Liverpool Games was the very first one in which only sports amateurs could compete, though only male amateurs were allowed. Plus, they also had an international outlook to them. We'll now take a look at the Greek and the Ottoman Empire Games. In 1856, a wealthy Greek-Roman philanthropist named Evangelos Zappos wrote to King Otto of Greece. Zappos had proposed to the king that a permanent revival of the ancient Olympic Games be established. Now, Zappos in 1859 sponsored and funded the first Olympic Games, which were held in the city square in Athens, Greece. Athletes from various Greek and the Ottoman Empire participated in the revival of the ancient Olympic Games. Afterwards, Evangelos Zappos would fund the restoration of the ancient Panathenaic Stadium so that it could host all future Olympic Games. The Panathenaic Stadium had originally been built to honor the Greek goddess known as Athena. Originally, the stadium had wooden seats, and in 329 BC was rebuilt in marble, and by 140 AD had been enlarged and renovated by Herodes Atticus, giving it a seating capacity of 50,000 people. Almost 2 millenniums later, during the 1860s, the remnants of this ancient structure were excavated and refurbished with the money provided by Evangelos Zappos for the revival of the Olympic Games. In 1859, the Panathenaic Stadium would be refurbished a second time for the historic Olympic Games of 1896. The real credit for the modern Olympic Games rightfully goes to Baron Pierre de Coubertin. Baron Coubertin was a bit of a visionary. In 1890, after attending the Olympian Games of the Wenlock Olympian Society, Baron Coubertin saw what the Olympic Games were and what they could be. Baron Corbin was inspired to found the International Olympic Committee, and from June 16th to the 23rd of 1894 at the Sorbonne University in Paris, the committee had been formed. On the last day of this very meeting, the International Olympic Committee had decided that the first Olympic Games under the auspices of the IOC would take place in Athens in 1896. Demetrius Vikalas was elected as the first president of the IOC. However, from 1896 through 1925, Baron Corbin became the second president of the IOC. There was, of course, a lot more to it than what I have just given, but I wanted each of you to have a general idea of where the origins of the modern-day Olympic Games came from. As you can tell by now, the history of the modern Olympic Games is quite a long one. Born from Greek mythology, realized in 776 BC, emulated and copied by various nations throughout the 17th, 18th, and 19th century, and once again, eventually realized in the so-called modern times of 1896. The Olympic Games had been revitalized at that point. Interest now in the modern games is no longer a local or just something of national interest. This has become an international sensation with sport competitors from all across the globe. Now, before we take a look into those events of more recent modern Olympic Games, we shall go into the past and examine one particular game so that we can get a better grasp of those events going on right now within the Olympic Games of 2012 in London, England. Now we're going to get into the 1936 Summer Olympic Games, as I had hinted to at the last section. It was on April 26, 1931 that Berlin had won the bid to hold the 11th Olympic Games over Barcelona, Spain. They lost the bids, but the Germans had managed to lock in the bid. Now this was 2 years before Adolf Hitler had come into power. However, when Hitler did come into power in 1933, the Nazis decided that they were going to outdo the 1936 Los Angeles Olympic Games of America. Why such extravagance? Why was Hitler putting out all the stops to put on such an incredible event? Was his motives based solely on patriotism, or did he have an agenda? Oh, Hitler did have an agenda, a three-part agenda at that. The first part of his agenda was based on politics. The second was based on his huge ego. And the third part was based upon incorporating illuminati elements into the Olympic Games. Before looking into Hitler's three-part agenda, we must digress through the annals of history. It was on November 11, 1918, that World War I had ended. The state of war that had existed between Germany and the Allied power had finally come to an end, but not without serious consequences to Germany. On June 28, 1919, the Treaty of Versailles had been signed, and now Germany was going to have to pay for supposedly starting World War I. The price of war for Germany was absolutely horrific. Part of the punishments inflicted upon Germany for supposedly starting World War I, if we go by the Treaty of Versailles, are as follows. Germany, along with Austria and Hungary, were to assume full responsibility for causing World War I. Germany would not be allowed to have any real standing army or machinery of war. Germany was to pay war reparations. The total amount that was basically extracted out of Germany for war reparations and such came to over 132 Deutschmarks. Now, in today's term, that would come out to be approximately 442 billion American dollars. Now, that was a staggering, if not unheard of, amount of money in 1921. But yet this was part of what Germany was supposed to pay for war reparations, and this was close to the Depression era now. Other concessions that was added as a result of Germany supposedly starting World War I. We know that Germany was a defeated nation. They ended up in poverty. They were unable to defend themselves, and they were forced to admit that World War I supposedly was all their fault, and we know it wasn't. We know that, in fact, it was the Illuminati that had fomented World War I as part of the 7-part plan towards the creation of a new world order, as demonstrated throughout this entire DVD series. But suffice it to say, history would blame Germany for what had happened during World War I. Now, anyone who's ever read the Treaty of Versailles would understand that eventually a Second World War would have to happen. Anyone who has read the Treaty of Versailles would understand that eventually a Second World War was inevitable. Considering the unheard of demands placed upon the German citizenship, something eventually would have to give. And eventually, something had, in the form of Adolf Hitler. Now, I'm not going to give you a history lesson into Adolf Hitler or the Third Reich. His involvement as a puppet leader of the Illuminati has already been demonstrated throughout this DVD series. What I needed to do here was to give you an understanding of what Germany was going through up until the time when Hitler became the Chancellor of Germany 12 years later in 1933. You will understand shortly why it is important to remember that Germany was a defeated and disgraced nation. They had become the ultimate pariah upon the face of the earth. Now, let's go back to 1931. On April 26, 1931, Germany had won the bid to host the Olympic Games, which would be held in Berlin, Germany in 1936. A decade prior to this, the Treaty of Versailles had made the German people a leper colony. Now, at least on the surface, it appeared that all had been forgiven. You know, the people of Germany was now being recognized as a nation. No one was pointing the fingers at each other. And by allowing the Germans to hold the 11th Summer Olympic Games, Germany would automatically be propelled internationally upon the face of the world. This simple and innocent act of the International Olympic Committee would allow a look into the inner workings and beliefs of the Illuminati in a way no one could have predicted. In 1933, Adolf Hitler became the dictator of Germany, and at first was not really interested in the games. However, the Illuminati were. It must be remembered, for those of you who have been following this DVD series, you know, from the very beginning, that it was the Illuminati who put Hitler into power. Germany was a small-scale experiment of the Illuminati to determine how the world would react to the horrors that would be inflicted upon them. And the Illuminati were going to stamp, literally speaking, the Olympic Games with their own brand of occultism. Some would say that it was Joseph Goebbels who convinced Hitler to allow the games. Those in the Illuminati would say otherwise. Now that Hitler suddenly decided to change his mind and hold the Olympic Games of 1936, let's take a look at how the Illuminati themselves changed the Olympic Games around so that they could now add new occult features to them. Now, the first thing that was new in the 1936 Berlin Olympic Games was the Olympic torch. You see, never before in the entire history of the Olympic Games was there any individual who would Olympic torch from one country to another, only, to end up lighting the Olympic bowl or whatever it's called nowadays. That never happened. Now, the lighting of the Olympic bowl, or what is now called a cauldron, and this is interesting, it's now referred to as a cauldron. This was an Illuminati invention, and there are many reasons for putting this particular spin on the Olympic Games. First of all, it must be remembered that originally the Olympic Games was not just a sporting event, but primarily a religious event to honor Zeus, the head of the Greek pantheon, through various occult rituals, sacrifices, and so on. Next, during the ancient Olympic Games, there was no ceremony which involved an Olympic torch or anything even remotely similar to it. This began in Nazi Germany. Let me show you this ceremony. Let me show you exactly what I'm talking about here. You see, the lighting of the Olympic torch first begins in the ancient temple of Hera, located in Olympia, Greece, where the first games were held. Vestal virgins, or who were temple prostitutes, are led into the ancient temple of Hera by a high priest to begin the lighting of the torch ceremony. A series of ceremonial dances to honor the gods are performed by the Vestal virgins or prostitutes. And once the ceremony, the dances was over with, the high priestess would step forward and begin to invoke the ancient gods themselves. Now, at her feet would be a parabolic mirror that will gather the rays of the sun so that a fire can be lit that will be used to light the torch with. Dancers, athletes, musicians, and other performers add to the pomp and circumstance of this ceremony. Once the torch has been lit, an attendant will bring an ancient-looking pot to the high priestess, and she in turn will light the pot with the torch she is bearing. Now, while holding the pot, an invocation is made to the Greek god Apollo to bless the ceremony. Next, the first relay runner to the Olympic Games will walk up to the high priestess of Hera and have his torch, the Olympic torch, lit by the high priestess. The first relay runner will then run throughout various parts of Greece while carrying the torch, and eventually the torch will be relayed from one runner to another, and so on, until the Olympic torch has been carried to all 5 continents. And then the Olympic torch will end up in the stadium of that country that is hosting the Olympic Games for that year. In this instance, that would have been Berlin, Germany, for the 1936 Olympic Games. According to the ancient Greek myths, Prometheus, a titan, created man from clay. One day, in order to help his creation of mankind, to move them along the evolutionary scale, if you would, he stole fire from the gods. This act gave man hidden knowledge and allowed him to progress and become civilized. And it is the same pagan god who stole, symbolically speaking, secret knowledge from the gods that is immortalized in front of the Rockefeller Center in New York, which we had previously discussed back in DVD 2 of this series. Plus, let's not forget, David Rockefeller, as an illuminist, is noted for making a number of statements that are very emblematic of secret knowledge and secret plans for things yet to happen. David Rockefeller said, "Some even believe we are a part of a secret cabal working against the best interests of the United States, characterizing my family and me as internationalists and with conspiring with others around the world to build a more integrated global political and economic structure. One world, if you will. If that's the charge, I stand guilty, and I am proud of it. All we need is the right crisis, and the nations will accept the new world order. I believe it's quite obvious that this is the Greek version of the Garden of Eden when Adam and Eve ate of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. However, in the eyes of the Illuminati, this knowledge is represented symbolically with a lit torch. Now, this symbol of occult knowledge was best demonstrated by Eliphas Levi when he created the drawing known as the mezzanine goat with the torch of hidden knowledge in between his horns. Levi was both a Freemason and an Illuminist, and the Illuminati was going to demonstrate that they carried this hidden occult knowledge into Nazi Germany through the 1936 Olympic Games. The 2012 Olympic torch was purposely shaped like the Illuminati capstone that contains the eye of Lucifer inside of it, but more of this matter will be covered later on. The bell tower of the 1936 Olympic Games was also an added new feature through the Illuminati. The bell tower stood exactly 247 feet high, which in numerology breaks down to the number 13. I'm sure you folks who have kept up with this series, you know what we're talking about when we're speaking of the number 13. Occultically speaking, this bell tower was absolutely necessary since the 1936 Olympic Games ceremonies were also invoking ancient gods, and interesting enough, after Hitler had been driven into the Olympic Stadium and then inspected a troop of soldiers, he then entered into this bell tower. The reason he did, and this may sound strange to some of you, but the reason he entered into the bell tower building itself was to communicate with the souls of departed German soldiers who were killed in World War I. Now, any occult practitioners would recognize what Hitler had been doing then is known as necromancy. Necromancy, that's the occult practice of communicating with the dead so that you can receive either information or their blessings, if you would. Now, it has always been believed in the ancient world that the sounding of a bell will invoke, if you would, it will garner the attention of the gods, and they will listen to you through various rituals and ceremonies, and in this case, this would be the 1936 Berlin Games. You know, the bells were sounded, the gods were paying attention to Hitler, blessing the games, and he'd be able to communicate with the dead soldiers. Now, I know this sounds bizarre to a lot of you folks, but this is just how it is and how they practice these things in the occult world. Now, the bell itself, the actual physical bell, had an eagle, or what is truly recognized in the occult world as a phoenix bird, holding onto the 5 Olympic rings, along with the Nazi swastika that, as I've mentioned in the series before, the swastika actually is a symbol, just like the phoenix bird itself is actually a symbol of reincarnation. And it's because the 1936 Olympic Games were going to be held, and I mean opened, I should say, on August 1st exactly, it became imperative that both symbols, the Nazi swastika and the Nazi eagle, or the phoenix bird, be placed on the Olympic bell, as you will shortly discover. In the Illuminati, the date of August 1st is very significant. For those of you who have been following along in this DVD series, you know that it is one of the 8 nights in which human sacrifice is being performed, as explained in DVD 2, known as America's Occult Holidays. It is also on this Sabbath, August 1st, that illuminists believe that death and rebirth through reincarnation is in full swing. And this is part of the secret symbols that the Illuminati were using for the 1936 Olympic Games. Germany, through reincarnation, was going to come back with a vengeance under Adolf Hitler and his Nazi regime. During the occult Sabbath of Lunarside, August 1st, bells are rung numerous times to honor the dead, which is why Hitler had the bell tower built so that he could walk inside of it and honor the dead just as occult practice would deem it to be. Another structure of Nazi Germany that held very significant occult symbolism was the entryway to the Olympic Stadium. According to the ancient accounts of Plato, when Hercules was trying to complete his legendary 12 labors, he had to pass through 2 massive pillars located in the Mediterranean Sea and enter into the realm of the unknown. Other accounts also say that beyond what has now become known as the Pillars of Hercules, the ancient city of Atlantis could be found. The Pillars of Hercules is the ancient name given to the promontories that flank the entrance to the Straits of Gibraltar, which marks the exit from the Mediterranean Sea to the Atlantic Ocean. Atlantis was the mythological city that possessed secret knowledge and wisdom that allowed it to become the great city that it had become known throughout history. Actually, the greatest, supposedly, of all cities in all of history now. And it is for this reason that the Pillars of Hercules were placed in front of the 1936 Olympic Stadium. The Illuminati, symbolically speaking, were stating that it's through these 2 mythological pillars that you will walk into the new Atlantis, Nazi Germany, where advanced technology and superior beings could be found. The 1936 Olympic Games did have advanced technology in the form of broadcast television, as you will shortly see. Plus, let's not forget that Adolf Hitler always was espousing the superiority of the German race, and that they came from an ancient people that were superior to all those in the world. What really astounded me was with the 2012 Olympic Games is that so many writers and others actually believe this was the first time in which the Illuminati eye was used. This is not true. The first time the eye of the Illuminati had been used was during the 1936 Olympic Games of Nazi Germany. On this 1936 postcard of the Olympic Village, towards the middle of the top and to the left, you can easily see that the eye of the Illuminati is quite prominent. For those of you who cannot readily see the eye of the Illuminati, please take a look at this next photo and you will see that the eye has been circled with a red circle, and that in the center of it is the eye of the Illuminati. For the first time in all of recorded history, a new technological device was going to be used to film the 1936 Munich Olympic Games. That new device was called a television camera. Some as long as 6 feet long, 21 cameras were used during the Olympic Games and were broadcast to 28 different viewing rooms across Germany. An estimated 150,000 people went to these viewing rooms and watched a picture projected onto an 8x10 screen. And so, the very first television broadcast would be that of the ceremonies used in ancient and modern times to celebrate and honor pagan gods. And to this very day, pagan gods are called upon to attend every Olympic game. Even footage of the first Olympic torch lighting ceremony can be seen in Lenny Reichenstahl's film called Olympia of 1938 in the prologue. So in conclusion, the 1936 Olympic Games of Nazi Germany was used as a political propaganda event. However, like the original Olympic Games of ancient Greece, the Illuminati, through their puppet, Adolf Hitler, brought into the 1936 Olympic Games the second element. That element was the occult religion. Ancient occult rituals being reenacted, occult instruments, necromancy, the eye of the Illuminati, and other occult elements being viewed by hundreds of thousands throughout the news media of television, which back then, if you remember, was just a new fandangled toy. No one knew if it was going to come or go. But the Illuminati, they truly transformed the 1936 Olympic Games into an occult event. And beginning in 1996, the Illuminati were going to bring their occult religion into the Olympic Games in a way no one could have foreseen. All that being said, ladies and gentlemen, let's move up the timeline by 60 years and take a look at what happened during the 1996 Olympic Games that was held in Atlanta, Georgia, in the United States of America. In this section, we're going to cover the Olympic Games of 1996 in Atlanta, Georgia. To begin with, these games would make the centennial celebration of the Olympic Games the 100th year celebration of the modern games. Secondly, it would show the unification of the ancient world with that of the modern world, which is very significant because, thirdly, it would begin a story, a very occultic story that would thread itself from 1996 through 2012 and possibly beyond, as you will soon discover. Beginning on July 19, 1996 and running through August 4, 1996, the 100th year celebration of the modern day Olympic Games would be held in Atlanta, Georgia. Beginning on July 19th in the early parts of the evening, the famous opening ceremony of the Olympic Games would begin. Part of the various ceremonies to the Olympic Games would be the Olympic Parade of Nations. Athletes from, I believe it's 197 countries around the world would participate in the 1996 Olympic Parade of Nations. They would enter the Olympic Stadium, and while wearing various colorful costumes and march around, the stadium while waving, their national flags and such, as the crowd would cheer them on. Also, as tradition demands, it would be Greece, where the Olympic Games first began, that would lead the Olympic parade. What has to be considered one of the most anticipated events of any Olympic Games is the entrance of the Olympic torch. Though the modern day Olympic marathon of carrying the Olympic torch, through various parts of nations and all this other stuff, it began in the occult world, if you remember, of Nazi Germany. It was actually built upon a story or a legend, if you would. In 490 BC, an army from Persia landed upon the plains of Marathon, about 26 miles away from Athens, with the intention of capturing and enslaving the Greek city. Had the Persian Empire defeated the independent Greek state, the history of the ancient world would have been rewritten, because the eastern power of Persia would have taken over and conquered what we now call Europe. This battle had been one of the most decisive events of world history, and while the massive Persian army was landing on the shore, the Athenians sent a man named Philippides to Sparta to enlist their aid in defeating the Persians. Accordingly, Philippides ran 150 miles to Sparta in only one day. No mean feat by any stretch of the imagination. However, most Athenian soldiers were used to running great distances, but not always, and certainly not 150 miles. This was a phenomenal feat done by a loyal Athenian soldier. Philippides had returned with news that the Spartans would come to their aid, except they wouldn't be able to come until the moon was full because of their religious laws. The Athenians decided not to wait upon the arrival of the Spartan army. Instead, they launched an all-out assault against the Persian Empire while they were still landing. Now, if the historical numbers are correct, even though the Athenians were outnumbered by the Persians by 4-1, 6,400 Persians lay dead on the field while 192 Persians were killed. The surviving Persians landed their boats and were sailing towards Athens in hope of conquering before the Greek armies could be reassembled. Philippides, even though he fought all day long in full battle armor, was sent out once again to deliver a message, this time to the citizens of Athens, of a possible Persian assault. Philippides covered the distance of 26 miles in 3 hours, and once having delivered his message, died on the spot from sheer exhaustion. And it was from this event that the marathon race was created from, and why the Olympic torch to this very day is carried over such long distances. Originally, during the modern day Olympic Games, Nazi Germany came up with this Olympic torch event as another means of propaganda and trying to prove, German superiority over the rest of the world. The big question that should be asked now is, how do these events affect the Olympic torch race nowadays? Certain facts about the origins of the Olympic flames must be remembered. First, they were created under a society that was not only heavily occultic in their beliefs and practices, but it was this same occult society, the Nazi regime, who fell back to an even more ancient society, the Grecian Empire, whose origins of the Olympic Games were steeped in an occult religion. It was almost inevitable that the Olympic Games were once again going to be put under the umbrella of the occult, and as I'm about to demonstrate, the occult religion that the Olympic Games would be put under is called Luciferian witchcraft, the occult religion of the Illuminati. To the untrained eye, the 1996 Olympic torch lighting ceremony was simply that, a ceremony. But there was more occult symbolism going on than most people would ever know or recognize. Let's begin by examining the Olympic torch lighting ceremony, and then we'll move on to other aspects of the 1996 Olympic Games. In order to understand the true depth of the mysteries behind the Olympic torch ceremony, with all of its symbolic meanings, allow me to tell you an occult story of life, death, reincarnation, and magic. The story goes, somewhere in the far-off distant past, the goddess of the occult world wanted to understand all the mysteries of this world, including the mysteries of death. She decided to travel the vast passages to the underworld where she would confront death. As the goddess reached the entrance to the underworld, she was met by a number of guardians who told her to remove all her clothing and jewelry because those things are meant for living people, and she was now about to enter the realm of the dead, where such things are not allowed. In other words, you really can't take anything with you when you die. After the goddess removed everything, she was bound and brought to Death himself. Once Death looked upon the goddess, her beauty was so overwhelming that he knelt down and kissed her feet. He then said, "Blessed are your feet, for they brought you through the vast passageway and to me. Live with me and allow me to place my cold hand upon your heart." The goddess replied, "I don't love you. Now, tell me, why do you take away all those things I love and enjoy? Why do you allow them to die?" Death replied, "Those events are caused by age and fate, and I have no power over such things. It is age that caused all things to grow old and wither, but when human beings die, I give them rest, peace, and strength. Once their spirits have become vitalized, they may return to the earth through reincarnation. Now, I ask you, once again to live with me, for you are truly beautiful." The goddess answered, "I do not love you." Death then said, "Since you won't live with me, you must receive a scourging." The goddess then replied, "It is fate." And then she knelt down, and after Death had scourged her, she said, "I felt the pains of love." Death said, "Blessed be." And he gave her the fivefold kiss, and then said, "Only through pain and suffering can you truly understand joy and knowledge." Once Death had done these things to the goddess, he taught all the mysteries she wanted to learn. They then copulated and were one. After this, Death taught the goddess all the magics that there were. The goddess had learned that there were three great events in the life of a human being: love, death, and reincarnation into a new body. And it is only through magics that these things can happen. In order to complete love, you must return to the same place and time as a person who was loved, and you must remember and love them again. But in order to be reincarnated, you must first die and be ready to receive a new body. And in order to die, you must first be born. And without love, you cannot be born. And these things are part of the great mysteries. Now, let's sum up the events of this story. An earth goddess took a trip through vast passages into the underworld to retrieve arcane knowledge. As with most cultural and occult myths, this secret or occult knowledge is symbolized by fire, such as the story when Prometheus stole fire from the gods. He had a torch. And in my humble opinion, the torch, which symbolizes secret or occult knowledge, was best illustrated by Eliphas Levi when he drew the mezzanine goat. The same earth goddess, upon speaking with Death, was beaten because she did not love him. After the beating, and once they had copulated, Death revealed to her all the mysteries she wanted to learn, and he even taught her all the magics. After which, the goddess returned to the earth with all the knowledge she was given, because she had to endure so much to acquire such knowledge. Now, let's compare the earth goddess story itself, to the 1996 Olympic torch lighting ceremony, and see if anything even remotely sounds familiar to you. As tradition demands, the Olympic torch was lit in Olympia, Greece, through an ancient occult ceremony, which we already discussed in section 2. Once the Olympic torch was lit, it was carried by more than 10,000 runners. It was carried by at least 15,000 miles, and this took 84 days to complete. The last person to have carried the Olympic torch outside of the Olympic Stadium was Al Order. Al Order was a legendary discus thrower for the United States team. Al had also competed in 4 Olympic Games from 1956 through 1968, and he had won the gold medal in his field. Normally, the Olympic torch would have been carried at ground level with the stadium, but this tradition was purposely broken. As the news commentator stated, Al had entered into the bowels of the stadium, which symbolizes the descent into the underworld where the hidden knowledge of occult magic was kept. Al was descending through the underground passageway, which was the same thing the goddess had done when she passed into the underworld, symbolically speaking. Al Order, while going through those underground passages, had met up with Evander Holyfield, the famous boxer who had previously won a bronze medal in the Olympic Games, and had lit his torch by the one Al was carrying. Evander Holyfield then descended even further into the bowels of the Olympic Stadium, or the underworld, while carrying his torch. Meanwhile, there was a gigantic golden-colored solar disk, which, occultically speaking, is the eye of Lucifer, sitting in the middle of the Olympic Stadium. This solar disk, or eye, had an empty center for a very good reason. Once Evander Holyfield had reached the end of the underground passageways while holding the Olympic torch high overhead, almost in a mystical fashion, emerges from that empty middle section of the eye. The flames of the torch, which were seen first, shows that occult knowledge had been retrieved from the underworld as revealed by the flaming eye of Lucifer when the torch was being raised up through the center of the solar disk, or eye. Next, Evander Holyfield begins to run across the track of the Olympic Stadium while carrying the torch of illumination. Evander pauses during his run and is met by Vula Patilo, who was the first Greek woman to win medals in track and field. She had in fact won gold medal. At this point, Vula takes hold of the eye of illumination, and while Evander Holyfield is also holding on to the torch, they both begin to run around the stadium in unison. This simple little act had a lot of symbolism behind it. First, it showed the union of man with women, or symbolized the god and the goddess of the occult world. It also symbolized the union of America with ancient Greece. The union of the old world with the new world were brought together. And finally, it also symbolized the modern day Olympic Games ceremony with the occult religious ceremonies held during the ancient Olympic Games, as demonstrated by this Olympic pin. Evander Holyfield and Vula run around the track some more and meet up with Janet Evans. Now, Janet Evans was a 4-time Olympic gold medalist. She had won her medal in swimming and is considered to be the greatest female distance swimmer ever. Janet Evans, once her torch had been lit, takes it and runs around the rest of the field. This symbolizes that the occult knowledge that had been taken from the underworld has now been brought through throughout basically the entire world, as I will demonstrate in a few minutes. While all these events are transpiring, Beethoven's famous composition, Ode to Joy, is being played in the background. When we look at the original German translation of Ode to Joy, you will find another major occult connection. The opening verses of this song are as follows: Joy, beautiful spark of the gods, daughter of Elysium, we enter fire-imbibed heavenly thy sanctuary. Elysium, or what is also known as the Elysian Fields, was part of the underworld but separated from Hades according to Greek religion and philosophy. It was here that certain individuals would go to once they died and would be able to live a happy and blessed afterlife, if you would. Originally, Elysium was reserved for those who were related to gods, or what's also known as demigods, children of, the gods themselves. In other words, this was the afterlife for occult gods. The second stanza of Ode to Joy says, thy magic reunites those whom stern custom has parted. All men become brothers under thy gentle wing. The stern custom that is being referred to in this song is death. However, through magic, everyone is able to be reunited in death and live together as brothers. This is the exact same belief you will find in witchcraft, except they don't call it Elysium or the Elysian Fields. In the occult, that place is called the Summerlands. So it becomes quite obvious why the Ode to Joy was being played while an occult ceremony was being performed at the 1996 Olympic Games in Atlanta, Georgia. Now, let's take another look back at the Olympic torch. Once Janet Evans had completed the journey around the track in the stadium, she then began running up a ramp that would lead to another person. This trek up the ramp symbolizes that the hidden occult knowledge was being brought up from the underworld. Remember, she is now carrying the torch of illumination. Once Janice had reached the top of the ramp, she lights someone else's torch. The last person whose torch had been lit by Janet was Muhammad Ali. For those of you who are unaware who he is, Muhammad Ali is still considered to be one of the greatest boxers in history. He came up with the slogan about himself when he said, I float like a butterfly and sting like a bee. Well, that was the nature of Muhammad Ali. As an 18-year-old Olympian, Muhammad Ali had won the gold medal in boxing in 1960 in Rome in the light heavyweight division. Even though Ali had been stricken with Parkinson's disease by this time, he was still able to take his torch and, while reaching down with it, lit what appeared to be a swatch of cloth connected to a metal line of sorts. Once this cloth, or whatever it may be, was lit, it was quickly reeled from ground level up to where the Olympic cauldron sat very high above the ground. Now, due to the fact that not only was it dark outside at this time, and also to the fact that the top of the ramp was so far away from most people, when the lit cloth was being reeled up to the cauldron above, it had a mystical and magical appearance to it because you could not tell that it was being reeled upwards. It actually looked like it was rising up to the cauldron under its own power. So, once again, it appears that the hidden occult knowledge was rising up from the underworld, and once it had lit the Olympic cauldron, it showed that the world was now being illuminated because of the occult knowledge that had been brought up from the underworld. Tradition was going to be broken yet again because the name of the Olympic bowl had been changed to the Olympic cauldron, which, in the occult world, is where occultists will mix various potions or practice the art of alchemy within it. Occult cauldrons are also used when animal or human body parts will be placed into it once they have been sacrificed for certain rituals or ceremonies. Once again, tradition was going to be purposely bypassed with the way the Olympic Bowl would be lit. During the 1936 Olympic Games, the Olympic Bowl was lit with a torch that had been counted. In the 1952 Helsinki Olympic Games, the bowl had once again been lit by the last runner. But in the 1992 Barcelona Olympic Games, famous archer Antonio Revelos shoots a lit arrow into the Olympic Bowl. While in 2008 Beijing Games, Li Ling mystically flies around the Olympic Stadium in a symbolic act that represents Prometheus stealing fire from the gods and giving it to mankind. In each and every occurrence, the Olympic Bowl was lit by obvious means. And while it was seen and known that Muhammad Ali had lit the swatch of cloth that eventually lit the 1996 Olympic Bowl, it rose seemingly by some sort of mystical power as evidenced by this photo. So, the symbolic act of the ancient Olympic Games with that of the 1996 modern Olympic Games becomes obvious. The ancient story of Prometheus, given the world illumination, is met in unison with the occult version of the goddess-given man illumination. And further elements which unify both the old world with the new world Olympic Games through the occult belief systems will now be covered. To prove just how occult 1996 Olympic Games truly were, what we need to do is look at certain Olympic symbols and events that had occurred. These elements will further your understanding into the whole of the picture of the Olympic Games from 1996 through 2012. To begin with, Atlanta, Georgia had put in a bid like everyone else. However, what most people do not realize is that they had created a logo that would or would not be used as the official logo for the 1996 Games. If you've been following along the teachings throughout the series, you will immediately recognize this next symbol. This symbol, known as a pentagram, was the official logo for the 1996 Olympic Games when Atlanta, Georgia was put in its bid. And again, for those of you who have been following along with this DVD series, you know by now that the pentagram is the oldest symbol in existence for the original co-founder of witchcraft, and that was Nimrod, who symbolically represents Lucifer. What did become the official logo for the 1996 Olympic Games, and which also incorporates the symbol of the other co-founder of witchcraft, which was Semiramis, can be seen in this next photo. This is a photo of the official logo for the 1996 Olympic Games. When we compare this photo to this next one, you can easily see they're one and the same. However, there are some very important occult differences you need to be made aware of. First of all, tradition was once again purposely broken because for the first time since the Games began, the Olympic Bowl would forever be referred to as a cauldron and not a bowl. Secondly, going back to the official logo, once again, there are three very obvious stars in the design that are growing smaller the further they move away. Now, before you look right below the first and biggest star in that logo, you will see what appears to be flames below. However, look immediately underneath that first star and you'll see that is actually a crescent moon that had been connected to those flames. And once more, within this DVD series, you had already been taught that the crescent moon is the oldest symbol in the occult world for the goddess, or for Semiramis, the original co-founder of witchcraft, along with his son, the other co-founder whose name was Nimrod. And his symbol was the five-pointed star, or the pentagram. In essence, when we see the crescent moon along with the pentagram, we see the oldest symbol for the god and the goddess, the mother and the son, the original co-founders of witchcraft. In witchcraft, when you see the crescent moon with three stars, you are also seeing the symbol for a third-level witch. Various occult groups symbolize a third-level witch by this symbol. There are variations of portraying the crescent moon and three stars, such as with this photo of Biggie, the amorphous 1996 Olympic Games mascot on yet another occult pin. Plus, you can see how they applied this logo on the official collectible coins. But I'm sure you can understand what I mean by all of this by now. Another part of the Olympic Games which showed the unification of the ancient world with the modern world can be seen in this next photo. The ancient Temple of Zeus was reconstructed using 8 pillars, each weighing 2,500 pounds each, with sheets strung up between those pillars. High priestesses, as they were called, are accompanied by musicians and athletes at the very beginning of the ceremony. The structure was called, interesting enough, the Temple of Zeus. So once again, we have another very obvious occult connection to the Olympic Games. From inside of the linen structure, lights are displayed upon the sheets, which give us images of what the ancient Olympic Games may have looked like. This ceremony gave us a look into the shadows of the past, but these shadows of the past would come back again because they had been revived in 1896. In essence, the cycle of reincarnation had now closed in upon itself because those 1996 Olympic Games would bring back the occult themes of the ancient occult games. This would be the new beginning of the ancient Olympic Games. The only thing that is different from the so-called modern Olympic Games to that of the ancient Olympic Games is that there were no sacrifices. During the ancient games, 100 animals were sacrificed at the Temple of Zeus, if you'll recall, so his blessings could be invoked upon everyone. Were there 100 animals butchered to Zeus at the 1996 Olympic Games? No. During the middle of the games, were the games halted so that an invocation or supplication could be made to Zeus or to any other ancient gods? No. So, it does appear that there was something different about the revised version of the ancient Olympic Games, or were they? Let me explain. During the ancient Olympic Games, the Greek goddess of victory, known as Nike, would be invoked. Then, during the middle of the games, 100 oxen would be sacrificed in that order. Now, what happened in the 1996 Olympic Games? During the modern Olympic Games of 1996, the Greek goddess, known as Nike, would be invoked as throngs of people were waiting for her arrival during the invocation, and which can also be seen by this newspaper from that time. The goddess Nike is also emblazoned on the Olympic medals that are given out to the victors, the gold, the silver, and the bronze. Once again, another tradition had been purposely broken. During the ancient Olympic Games, only one goddess, known as Nike, had been invoked. During the 1996 Games, 5 Nikes were invoked. In this next photo, looking towards the right and then to the background, you should be able to see what appears to be 5 colored streamers: blue, yellow, black, green, and red. Within each of these streamers are 5 different colored Nikes, which are supposed to represent the colors of those nations attending the Olympic Games. However, it is also those 5 colored Nike gods which made up the pentagram, which was the official logo that had been used by Atlanta when they were bidding for the right to hold the Olympic Games of 1996 in that city. The connection is obvious. Were any of the so-called gods of the ancient Olympic Games invoked or called upon? The answer is quite apparent. Yes. Now, were there any sacrifices made during these games? Unfortunately, the answer is yes, once again. On July 27th at 12:25 p.m. Central Standard Time, a bag containing 3 pipe bombs had exploded in Centennial Park. This park was a designated area where people attending the Olympics could sit and rest or just have a good time. Sadly enough, once the pipe bombs had exploded, 111 people were injured. 1 person died of a heart attack while running to the scenes, and 1 lady had been killed as a result of the explosion. The culprit was later apprehended, but the damage had been done. This was not an act of terrorism, but which has been reported as a lone person who was mentally unstable. But interesting enough, this person was able to acquire a United States military backpack in which 3 pipe bombs had been placed inside of it. Was this Centennial Park bombing a horrible coincidence? Again, I doubt it. So often in the past when something like this happens, the individual is unstable and yet somehow is able to get a hold of military equipment. Lee Harvey Oswald was supposedly the unstable lone gunman who killed Kennedy and who also had access to military hardware. Then there was Timothy McVeigh, supposedly, he was the lone person who planted the bomb which destroyed the Oklahoma City federal building. And yet, Ted L. Gunderson, who had retired as the senior director of the Los Angeles Department of the FBI, was able to prove that a military bomb, which consisted of 2 stages, was responsible for destroying that building. And now, supposedly, we have another unstable individual who is solely responsible for this act. I'm just not buying it. Too often in the past, I've seen how the Illuminati will always use a fall guy to take all the blame to cause someone into getting into trouble or whatever, and too often I have seen these same fall guys be executed so no one would be able to find out the truth of what really happened. It's that those poor people who died or who were injured in Centennial Park were all sacrifices. It fits in perfectly with the methodology of the Illuminati, and it certainly fits in with the sacrifices that were necessary for the Olympic Games. And now, the modern Olympic Games. And it was all necessary. Since, in 1996, the Illuminati was going to mark the revival and 100th year return of the so-called modern Olympic Games, all the necessary elements of the original games were going to have to be met. And unfortunately, they were. Let's recap those events as they appeared. The Olympic Games were opened with the invocation to 5 Nikes to bless the Games. This is against tradition. It was supposed to be only 1 Nike, but 5 were needed to form the pentagram on one of the Olympic logos. The ceremony involving the opening ceremony is the same story we find in the occult world, in which a goddess ascended into the underworld to acquire hidden occult knowledge. Then the blazing eye of Lucifer was seen in the center of the Olympic Stadium when the Olympic flame emerged from its center, which was again going against tradition because the torch was supposed to have been brought into the stadium at ground level. Once more, going against tradition, the Olympic Bowl is no longer called that. Instead, it is referred to as the Olympic Cauldron, which for anyone who has even a smattering of occult understanding knows that it's within the cauldron that occultists will mix potions and also put in the body parts of animals and humans they have sacrificed. The two other official logos that were used to mark the 1996 Olympic Games were easily recognized as occult symbols. The first being a pentagram, and the second one having the crescent moon with the 3 stars. The pentagram symbolizes Nimrod, while the crescent moon and stars symbolizes Semiramis, the original co-founders of witchcraft back in the ancient days of Babylon. The lighting of the Olympic torch cauldron was done through an act that had a very mystical appearance surrounding it. And let's not forget that there were no Olympic torch lighting ceremonies during the original ancient Olympic Games. This is a new tradition that was added through the Illuminati for the 1936 Berlin Games of Nazi Germany. The Olympic torch also has very mystical significance to it. According to certain versions on the legendary continent of Atlantis, the people who lived there worshipped a mysterious object known as the Torch of Light. No, that would be the Torch of Truth. And it was said to possess the light of universal wisdom, which, if I recall correctly, resided on top of a huge pyramid. And it was all the way back on DVD 1 in this series that I had explained that the Illuminati had predestined America to become the new Atlantis. In essence, the legendary Torch of Truth, which contained the light of universal wisdom, or occultically speaking, the light of Lucifer, was being passed into America. And sadly enough, there were sacrifices that had been done during the 1996 Games. The timing of July 19th was exactly 13 days before the human night sacrifice of Lunarsad, which is on August 1st. The overall significance of this, once again, can be found on DVD 2 called America's Occult Holidays. In conclusion, the whole of the 1996 Olympic Games begins an occult story. The story is one of life, death, and reincarnation. And as we look through the opening and closing ceremonies of the Olympic Games from 1996 through 2012, a very dark and insidious occult story will be revealed. The story tells us that in 1996, the world is becoming illuminated through Lucifer. Now, let's just see how far this story will take us.